Meanwhile, in neighbouring Sudan, the country's army says it has driven out its main rival, the Rapid Support Forces, from Khartoum. The recapture of the capital is a major turning point for the army after almost 2 years of fighting. Footage on Wednesday showed soldiers in Khartoum's presidential palace as well as the central market celebrating the withdrawal of the RSF. There was no immediate comment from the paramilitary group. The news also sparked celebrations in Port Sudan. But despite the significant blows dealt to the RSF, analysts have warned the war in Sudan is far from over. And with me in the studio now is Shana Lewis, a Sudan specialist and human rights consultant and senior advisor for PAIMA. I believe I pronounced that correctly. That's a US-based organization working with communities in Sudan. Now, we've just heard the army appears to have retaken the capital, Khartoum. Are we getting closer to the end of the war?
I sincerely hope so, because as we approach the 2-year anniversary, it's 2 years too long for the people of Sudan. And though this is a real moment of hope with scenes of jubilation across the country, but also in the region amongst the Sudanese diaspora and displaced community, this moment cannot be taken for granted. It's really incumbent on the Sudanese armed forces, now that they have regained control of the capital, to show their commitment to the protection of civilians in all areas under their control, and the protection of civilians in a manner that is not done on an ethnic or demographic basis, protection of all civilians from human rights violations and violations of humanitarian law. But unfortunately, this is not an end of the conflict. It's instead a shifting of the axis of conflict over towards Darfur, where in El Fasher, the capital of North Darfur, the RSF are continuing to try and push SAF out of their last remaining army base in the region.
Well, the RSF appears to be retreating southwards. Are they regrouping?
They seem to be. So they retreated south through Jebel Aulia yesterday, but that also reports that they're heading west back towards the Darfur region, which is of particular concern. And there are a lot of concerns right now that we're heading towards a splitting of the country, because in February, in Nairobi, the RSF announced that they were establishing a parallel government. And we're now heading towards these two very clear competing spheres of power of the RSF in Darfur and then SAF in the central and eastern portions of the country.
But splitting the country in two, if you will, would help end the fighting. What would be an argument against it?
Historically, within the region, the establishment of parallel governments never ends well. I mean, we can look at Libya. It is not a path to peace. It's a path to instead further entrenchment of conflicts. And ultimately, the territorial integrity of Sudan is not up for negotiation. It's instead incumbent on the RSF and SAF to come to the negotiating table and find peace in Sudan, so that we're not looking at the succession of Darfur from the entire country.
Now, let's come back to Khartoum. Thousands of people had to leave the capital when the war began 2 years ago. Can they return home now?
That's sincerely the hope, but unfortunately there's a severe lack of services in the capital right now. The images that we've seen are of complete destruction, and the humanitarian response has really been hindered, particularly by the recent global aid cuts since the beginning of this year. So for services to be provided to civilians in the capital requires a turning back on of that aid tap. But very importantly, for the localized humanitarian response in Sudan, the emergency response rooms, which are Sudanese youth who have been providing community kitchens and frontline medical services, they need resources to be able to do their job. And unless these resources are provided, we're going to have an influx of civilians back into Khartoum full of hope, and instead they're going to be met with famine and further food insecurity.
Very briefly, we've just heard that in South Sudan, the UN is warning of a renewed civil war there. What kind of impact will that have on the situation in Sudan?
If we were to see an emergence of civil war again in South Sudan, the world would not be able to cope. I mean, the current humanitarian response for Sudan is around 10% funded, and it's the same for South Sudan. I think we often forget that there is already a humanitarian crisis ongoing in the South, and the thought now of there being these two competing civil wars in the region would just be disastrous, and the world already does not have the resources to cope with the crises that we do have.
Shana Lewis, that's Sudan specialist and human rights consultant. Thank you very much, Shana.